Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the STP training webinar, The Hidden Requirements Exploring Emotions with Placebos. Our speaker for the day is Damien Sinadinos. I'm Smita Mishra, a professional tester myself, and I'm excited to host you all and Damien on our STP trainings. Incidentally, he has also been a speaker with us at our past STPCon conferences. How was your experience, Damien? And very warm welcome, first of all. You're welcome to the show. I really wanted to know how was your experience for the past few STP cons that you have attended? Anything specific that you liked?
Hi, Smita. Thanks for having me and hosting. I appreciate being here. I've lost track. I think I've been to at least 3 STP cons so far, and I think this will be my 4th coming up. I thoroughly enjoy all of them. It's always fantastic content. I get to catch up with some fantastic testing thought leaders and get to pick their minds and help refine my own thoughts. And I get to meet a lot of new testers that I was unfamiliar with before and learn a lot of new ideas. So it's always very enriching for me.
Absolutely. That's one of my reasons to be there every year. So for all our listeners today, let me tell you, we have our next conference coming up, Fall 2017 STPCon, to be held in the Washington, D.C. area from September 25th through 29th this year. So as you can see on the screen, we have various courses and certifications through these dates. There are workshops through September 26th and 27th, and then there are conference sessions through September 28th and 29th. So the topics typically include, especially this time, it includes across automation, agile, performance, DevOps, mobile, security, leadership, strategy, and so much more. We typically have more than, say, about 16 workshops and about 40 sessions for you to choose from. And the formats are like roundtables, case studies, hands-on exercises, and tool demos, like so much to choose from. And the complete program is actually published for you to explore at www.stpcon.com. And if you register by 26th of August, you get to save up to $400 off your registration. Damien, did you get a chance to look at the conference program and any selections so far on what sessions and workshops you are looking forward to?
Yeah, I did. I got a chance to look over the entire offering list, and it's a kind of a tough question because there's so many good talks and sessions that it's hard to choose any, but I don't want to slight anyone, but if I had to choose, here's a few that caught my eye. Eric Pregler is talking about performance testing 101. I sat through one of Eric's performance testing talks before, and I found it to be great, a super primer for anyone that's getting into it. At the same time, another workshop being given by Mark Tomlinson, infuriatingly fun performance puzzlers. I like that his takeaways involve problem solving and root cause analysis, which is something I'm interested in and we'll talk a little bit about today. If you're an experienced performance tester, this might be a great workshop for you. I'm super excited to see Paul Grozaffi give his keynote on judgment and responsibility. I think that those are very important ideas. Paul Merrill has a session called Storytelling, the Magical First Steps of Automated Testing. I'm a raconteur myself, so I'm interested to see how Paul weaves stories and is able to explain automated testing. Mike Lyles is doing a session called Testing is Not a 9-to-5 Job. I believe that is very true. Oftentimes I'll show up for my golf tee time 10 minutes before, and then I play horribly and wonder why I stink. And I think that Mike is going to speak to exactly that. Angie Jones has a few sessions. One that caught my eye is which tests should we automate? There's a pervasive idea that we should automate everything, and I hope that Angie's going to talk to that and temper that idea. And finally, Michael Bolton has a couple sessions, one of which is called How to Get What You Want from Testing. In his abstract, he says the best testers are like social scientists, understanding the software, the systems that are connected with it, and the people who use it and the relationships between them. That's a super idea, and again, is something that I'm going to be speaking about today, the relationship between people and software.
Wow, that's almost like my favorite list too. So awesome. And I actually saw you have a workshop too. What are you speaking on?
Well, I'm going to be doing a 1-hour version of what's going to be a half-day workshop at STPCon. It's called Exploring Emotions with Placebos, the Hidden Requirements. And just like part of, I think, Michael's presentation, it's going to be talking about the importance of emotions and feelings in software. And I'll be using placebos to talk a little bit about how you can focus on emotions to better understand them with regards to software.
Oh, That's really cool. Mm, you know, this is one conference which I keep going back to every year. So, and as a tester myself, I think conferring is one of the best ways to learn and also to get to know reputed testers across the globe, build good network connections. So I guess I really hope all of us find it to be the same way and we go for a conference. All right, guys, if you are on Twitter, please share the conference information and about this webinar with your followers and connections. We love the shout outs. And if you hear something you like during the webinar, please do tweet about it and use @SoftwareTestPro for a retweet from us. Another quick piece of information just before we start is that there is an upcoming webinar, Continuous Integration and How It Affects Testing by Paul Merrill on 9th August. Paul is a renowned speaker and has spoken at STP in past. He has a unique perspective on launching and maintaining quality products. I'm sure you'll find his talk interesting too. The link is up for you to review and register, so go for it. All right, let's get started with the webinar today. So a very warm welcome, Damien. We're very thrilled to have you with us today. And let me quickly introduce you for all of us here. So Damien started his testing software on purpose and for money in 1993. Since then, he has helped build build better software and build software better using various methods and tools in numerous roles at many companies in diverse industries. Over the past 10 years, Damien has focused primarily on teaching and leading testers and improving processes. Currently, he owns his own training and consulting company, Ineffable Solutions, specializing in IT and focusing on testing. Damien also enjoys performing improv comedy. He likes golfing, playing poker and basketball, gaming, acting, cartooning, and spending time with his family. Is there anything you've left, Damien? You could visit his site, ineffable so there's a hyphen in between, ineffable-solutions.com, and even connect with him for further training or work assignments. And there is, actually, that reminds me, this is one of the sites which has that very unique calendar. I have never seen it on any tester's site or a consultant site, where it's like for an initial appointment, I can actually go there, and if I just want to talk to Damien about something, I could book a slot with him right then and there. I do recall, now I recall somebody else doing it, but yes, this one was really impressive. I really like your site, Damien.
Thank you.
And I find it, I'm sure testers will make use of it. There's so much more I could talk about you and your vast experience and the extensive leadership Damien has on testing and being a trainer, but I'll let him do the rest of the talking. And right before we start, few housekeeping points for the next 1 hour. All the attendees shall remain muted throughout the webinar. You can type in your questions and share them with us through your question or chat box, whichever appears on your version of GoToWebinar. We shall take them up after Damien is done with his presentation. The webinar shall be recorded and posted on the Software Test Pro site for the attendees to go through later. So focus on learning and asking questions. All right, Damien, very warm welcome again, and the floor is all yours now.
Thank you, Smita. I appreciate the very kind, warm welcome. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone today. Now, just before I start, I want to make sure that everyone can see the title screen that reads The Hidden Requirements, Exploring Emotions with Placebos, and you can hear me clearly. Anybody, type in the chat window and let me know that you can indeed see and hear me properly.
There are tons of yeses coming up. Yes, they can see it. They
fantastic. Thank you very much. All right, so let's get into this. As I said, this is a 1 hour version of a 4 hour workshop that I'm going to be offering in a few months at STPCon. So let's head into it. Thanks to Smita's wonderful introduction, I don't have to spend a lot of time myself, but on the left is me and my company and a few ways to get a hold of me, as Smita suggested. If you are on Twitter and active, please include my either personal or professional Twitter handles about anything that I say that you like or perhaps hate. I'd love to hear your thoughts. On the right are a few labels that I think might be relevant to this webinar that might be used to describe me. First and foremost, I'm a tester, again, since 1993. I've been at about 15 companies in very diverse industries as a full-time employee, as a consultant. I've used lots of different methodologies that are traditional and modern. I've used a lot of different tools. I've been a manager. I also helped organize a regional conference in Columbus, Ohio in February called QA the Highway. The last few years, I've been acting as a mentor, coach, and advisor to IT and test professionals around the world. Also during this time, in addition to doing testing activities, occasionally I'll help do requirement activities, that is BA work, some people might refer to it. That is not just consuming requirements, but creating them as well. I'm also an improviser. I have over 10 years of experience of improvisation, comedic improvisation, standing on stage and creating a performance from nothing, just an idea, a suggestion. I'm a speaker. I travel around the world now and speak at conferences and corporations about fundamental topics that are applicable to IT and testing. I'm an artist. I've been cartooning since I was a child, and I use other mediums because I find it enjoyable and it brings joy to others. And finally, I'm a husband and father. I've been married for 7 years, and I have 2 adorable little time sinks. Now, each of these different labels, I think, is relevant to this because they all evoke some type of emotion. As a tester, I have to be sensitive to the emotions that our users might be feeling when they use our products, and that can help me better test the product and produce better test results. In addition, sometimes those test results are critiquing someone's work, so I should be sensitive to the emotions of those whose work I'm critiquing. As an improviser, sometimes I'm trying to elicit an emotion from the audience through acting on stage. So I have to understand different emotional aspects in order to elicit those proper emotions. As a speaker, speaking on stage is a different type of performance than improvisation, but again, reading people's faces and body language, understanding their questions can all relate back to some emotion. As an artist, sometimes I try and elicit emotions through nonverbal means or without any words at all. A cartoon or a sculpture I might try to elicit some emotion in someone. And certainly, as anyone that has a spouse or has children, you certainly should be attentive and sensitive to the emotions of your family and also understand your own emotions so you can better deal with them. Now, without knowing sufficient details about content, I try to not tell others what to do or how to do it until I know more about their context. I think it's unreasonable for me to try and instruct someone what things they should do or how they should do them if I don't know their context. So instead, what I try to do is share things that have worked for me in my particular context that might also work for you and yours. And the topics I'm going to be talking about today are all based on my personal and professional experience, and I've supplemented them with deep research, so I hope that they'll be useful to you as well. As is often suggested, I'm going to start with why. Why are we here today? Or perhaps why are we here in this webinar? What are you hoping to get out of it? What's the purpose? Why does it matter? What's the significance and the implications? So what? Who cares? Well, in the workshop, it's going to be very interactive, and one of the things I'll do is pause and ask the attendees why they're there. And I'll discuss their answers. And I wonder why each of you listening right now is here as well. Now, a few suggestions. In the abstract of this talk, I suggested some takeaways, including an introduction to placebos. Maybe you're here today to learn more about placebos and get an introduction to what they are. Another suggested takeaway from the abstract was a different and deeper perspective of testing. Perhaps you're new to testing, and this will give you a deeper understanding of it. Perhaps you're an experienced tester, and this will just give you a different perspective of what testing is, my perspective. Another takeaway was a practical approach to applying these ideas. Theory is great, but I also believe in tying theory to pragmatics and being able to go back to your desk and apply the things that you're learning and hearing about today. However, I will suggest one more overall reason, which is the way we feel about software is important. This is a claim that I'm going to make, and I'm going to try and support it through this presentation. About half the presentation will be me trying to support this claim, that the way that we feel about software is important. The other half of the presentation will be me suggesting ways that we might act on this claim, what we might do about it. If we believe this to be true, then what do we do? How am I going to do this? Here's the agenda. I'm going to start with some quotations. I'm going to try and support the claim by giving some quotations and appealing to authority and to your feelings from things that others have said. Next, I'll dive into the purpose of software. I'll try and support the claim by trying to show how the purpose of software might be related to emotions. Next, I'll dig into research. I'll try and support the claim by citing empirical evidence from the research of others. And next, I'll talk about requirements and try to show that requirements themselves can not only affect emotions, but might actually come from emotions. After that, I'm going to try and suggest some ways that you might act on this claim. I'm going to talk about emotional requirements and suggest ways that you can get emotional requirements and measure them. And finally, as is in the title of the talk, I'll talk about placebos. I'll introduce them and then use them as a metaphor and a lens through which to view software that might provide some insight. Now, this is necessarily a shallow presentation. The topics I'm talking about, requirements, emotion, emotional requirements, and placebos, they're fascinating, they're very, very large, and some of them are largely unexplored. There's not a lot of research around emotional requirements and the connection between people and software and feelings. There's certainly not a lot of research around placebos. It's a relatively poorly understood and unexplored area. So any 1 hour webinar is going to be inadequate, as is actually a half hour or a 4 hour half-day workshop. But hopefully, this brief introduction and presentation will serve to inspire you to think more about it and maybe motivate you to act. So I'll start with some quotations. I'm going to start by trying to give you some things that other people said that might make you feel a certain way. I'm going to appeal to authority and to your emotions. Now, both of these appeals are considered bad. They're considered logical fallacies. An appeal to authority is bad if the authority isn't relevant to the topic being discussed. Just because someone's notable or famous doesn't necessarily mean that they're an authority on some topic. But if an authority does have knowledge that's pertinent to a particular subject, then maybe considering their advice might be beneficial. So I'll leave it up to you to decide if the people making these quotes are authorities and if the ideas that they're presenting are relevant and meaningful. Similarly, an appeal to emotion is only manipulative if it's not backed by facts. Just because something makes you feel a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that it's right or correct. But sometimes fact-based statements can elicit emotions, so I'll leave it to you to decide if these quotes that make you feel a certain way make you feel the right way. Now in the workshop, after presenting a given quote, I'll pause and allow the audience to give their interpretation. Certainly when these people said these things, they intended some meaning to be behind it. But I'm also interested in what others take away from it, how they interpret it. So I encourage you, if you're listening to this as a recording, after each quote, pause and think about what it means to you before hearing my interpretation. First quote comes from Dale Carnegie, a famous American writer. He says, "When dealing with people, remember, you are not dealing with creatures of logic, but with creatures of emotion." Now, I like to think that all of my decisions are based on reason and logic, but in fact, they're probably influenced or maybe even driven by emotion. Later on, I'm going to try and show that many of the things that we want or need are actually driven by emotion. But I also like this quote, and I think it's relevant, considering that all software is directly or indirectly intended for use by people. Next quote comes from Maya Angelou, the American poet. It's a very famous quote of hers. It says, "I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." Now, to me, this quote means that feelings are deeper and they're more enduring than words or actions. In my experience, I found this to be true. Sometimes after some time has passed, I can remember how I felt about some situation, even if I can't remember the details of what was said or what was done. This quote's interesting. A 2014 Forbes article interviewed some successful business leaders, and they all said that this particular quote and the ideas presented in it, they used as guiding principles for their own careers and indeed their businesses. For example, Richard Branson said that the quote and those ideas inspired him, and he said customers shouldn't think of your business as a place to buy a product or use a service. It should be a fun place to be. Here, Richard Branson is encouraging us to focus less on the practical aspects of buying or using and more on the emotional aspects. Similarly, Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, says that it has a role and a meaningful relationship with people that is not only about the coffee. Success is very shallow if it doesn't have some emotional meaning. He appreciates that meaningful relationships and emotions are some key to success. In an interview with Oprah Winfrey, he talked about how he felt when he walked into an Italian cafe. He says, "I was out of my mind. I walked in and saw a symphony of activity and the romance of the theater of coffee. Coffee was at the center of conversation, at the sense of community. That's what spoke to me." He says, "I didn't want to bring the coffee back from Italy. I wanted to bring the feeling of the experience." Another person that was inspired by the ideas in the Maya Angelou quote says, it's George Blankenship, the former Apple and Tesla executive. He says, "We're not selling you anything. We want you to feel differently when you leave the store. Emotionally engage customers, don't transactionally engage them." I particularly like this quote because he contrasts transactionally and emotionally engaging customers. He focuses on feeling over function. Finally, Debbie Fields, the founder of Mrs. Fields Cookies, says something similar to Schultz of Starbucks. "I've never felt like I was in the cookie business. I've always been in a feel-good feeling business. My job is to sell joy. My job is to sell happiness. My job is to sell an experience. Again, Debbie feels that her product isn't cookies, but it's an emotional experience. So what do all these quotes indicate? What might they indicate? Perhaps that successful businesses and people recognize the importance of emotion. Now, by some measure, each of these people and businesses could be considered successful. And to some degree, perhaps that success owes to focusing on emotions. So maybe these quotes appealed to some authorities and to your emotions, and maybe provided some support to the claim that the way we feel about software is indeed important. Now I'm going to turn to the purpose of software. I'm going to try and continue to support my claim by attempting to show that the purpose of software is related to emotions. Why is software created? I talked about the importance of starting with why, the purpose, the reason that we do things. So why do we create software? One way to consider this question is from the opposite angle. Is it possible to create software with no purpose at all? Now in my workshop, again, we'll collaboratively ask this question and discuss the attendee answers, and I'll suggest a few of my own. Again, if you're watching, this might be a good time to pause and consider your own ideas. Why do we create software? What's the purpose? Now, before I go further, I do understand that the purpose can be misleading. It can indicate that there's a singular purpose, but with cause and effect, there might be multiple causes or reasons which can lead to multiple effects or results, just as there might be multiple purposes for software to exist. So while I understand that there might be multiple purposes for software to exist, my intent is to discuss individual purposes one at a time. Another caveat is that software, the word software, it's a very large category. It's very vague. At a high level, it might mean application software that's used for performing tasks. It might mean system software. It's used to start and run computer systems, or programs, tools that are used to create or even compile other computer programs. Regardless of these different categories, I believe that it's possible to think about and try and find a single, very high-level purpose that can apply to all of these different types of software. So what is the purpose of software? Specifically, I think the answer is infinite. Specifically meaning in some particular context, there's infinite answers. Maybe in a specific context, the purpose of some software is to fly planes or land planes. Maybe in some different context, is to buy and sell products. In another, to record financial activity, to save the princess or to crush candy, to process words, to browse the internet, to prevent or detect malware, to manage system resources, to compile other software. There's infinite reasons that we create software at a low level with a specific context. And while all these answers might be considered correct, they don't apply to all software. And I'm interested in thinking about and finding more generic, general purposes. Is it possible to find a higher level generic purpose? Generally, one answer I found on the internet was to organize information. Another answer that's very similar is to collect and process data. Some have suggested that these are more general, generic purposes. And I agree, they are more generic than and apply to more contexts. However, I don't see how organizing information or collecting and processing data might be reasonably a reasonable purpose when applied to a video game. If I'm thinking about Mario Brothers, I can't see how that's organizing information or collecting and processing data. So I agree that these are more general, but not general enough. Another answer I encountered was to simplify or automate workload. Again, more generic than the previous specific answers, but still doesn't apply to all software. Another answer was to maximize shareholder profit. If you agree that a purpose of a business is to maximize profit for shareholders, then it might extend that the purpose of software is to support and uphold that purpose. So the purpose of software might be to maximize shareholder profit. Now that assumes that you agree with the purpose of a business is to maximize shareholder profit. Now to me, for various reasons, all of these purposes might be considered more general and more correct than the previous ones, but they still didn't satisfy me. They didn't make me feel satisfied. So I tried to think of even more general answers. One that I encountered that I liked was to be useful. This comes from a gentleman named Stanislaw Christian, and he suggested a good software product is above all useful. If the end product meets the most of the business requirements and delivers value to the stakeholders, it's successful. Now, similar to how I asked, is it possible for software to have no purpose? I wonder, is it possible for software to have no use? Philosophically, if you show me something that you claim has objectively no value at all, then I'll say that that particular thing is valuable as an example of something with no value. But I wonder, If you agree that the purpose of all software is to be useful, I wonder how. How is software to be useful? Maybe one answer is to help people. Maybe a purpose of software is to be useful to help people. This answer comes from Max Kanat-Alexander. He's the author of Code Simplicity. In that book and on his blog, he suggests that an overall purpose of all software is to help people. Now, Max does recognize that helping people is relative. It's subjective. What might be helpful to one person might be harmful to another. But still, I wanted to dig deeper, and I wondered, help people do what? Well, one answer might be to solve problems. This followed logically to me, and it also was a very frequent answer I found online. A lot of sources suggested that an overall purpose of all software is to help us solve problems. But I wonder, what is a problem? What is a solution? So I'd like to digress for a moment and examine that. What exactly is a problem? What is a solution? I want to dig into this because I think emotions might be a key element in both. Now, problems and solutions are very tightly linked, so tight that it can be difficult to think about them without referring or talking about the other. But both problems and solutions are roughly things. That is, any object, activity, thought, anything that can be described in a specific way. And things have necessary attributes, properties, or features. That is, everything has certain qualities that make it unique and set it apart from other things. Now, sometimes these necessary attributes, properties, or features are called essential characteristics. In the world of definitions and linguistics, they're called the differentia, the attributes that distinguish a species of one thing from a species of something else in the same genus. So I'll try and explain this with an example. Consider a square. A definition of square might be a figure with 4 equal straight sides and 4 right angles. There's a square. So what are the essential characteristics of a square? One is that it has sides, but not just any amount of sides. It has exactly 4 sides. And not just 4 sides, but 4 equal in length sides. And not just 4 equal in length sides, but 4 equal straight sides. Some other characteristics that are essential to being a square are that it has angles, but not just any amount of angles, exactly 4 angles, and those angles must be right. So some essential characteristics of squares are 4 equal straight sides and 4 right angles. So for example, this is a square. It's a small square, but size is not an essential characteristic to being a square, so it can still be called a square. This is a square as well, even though it's a different color, because color is not an essential characteristic. This square is oriented differently, but the orientation of a square has no bearing on whether it's a square or not. Conversely, this is not a square because it violates one of those essential characteristics of what a square is. It has 4 sides, but they're not, 2 of the sides are not in equal length to the other 2. This is also not a square. It violates a few of the essential characteristics. It doesn't have the right number of angles, they're not the right degrees, it doesn't have the right number of sides. Similarly, this violates several essential characteristics of a square as well. So let's apply this idea of essential characteristics to problems. What is a problem? Now, there's a lot of definitions of problems depending on your source. The more you look, the more subtle variances and definitions there are. However, Oxford Dictionary says it's a matter or situation regarded as unwelcome or harmful and needing to be dealt with. Wikipedia says it's a problem. A problem is any given situation that differs from a desired goal. I like Brett Petticourt's pithy answer, which is he gives for a bug, which is anything that bugs someone. Jerry Weinberg says that a problem is a difference between things as desired and things as perceived. So I took many, many different sources and definitions and came up with this definition. A problem is an undesired state that differs from some desired state. So what are the essential characteristics of a problem? Interestingly, I couldn't find a lot of information regarding characteristics or structures of problems. Most of the literature out there is focused on research problems, where they come from, how to formulate them, and they're focused on scientific method, but they don't give a more generic understanding of what a problem is or what the essential characteristics and structure of it is. However, I think that some essential characteristics of a problem are, number one, there's an undesired state. Now, this implicitly means that it's relative. Something that's undesired to one person at one time might not be so to another person at a different time. Another essential characteristic is that a problem is different from some desired state. Now, perhaps you don't know how to get to that desired state. You don't know the means to get to that desired state. Maybe you don't even know what the desired state is, but it might be reasonable to say that the desired state is not the undesired state. Even if you have no details about how to get there or what it looks like, it's not the undesired state. So some essential characteristics of a problem is that it's undesired, it's an undesired state, and it differs from some desired state. What about solutions? Again, a lot of different definitions and sources, but roughly, a solution is some desired state that differs from some undesired state. Again, if you have a solution, it's probably going to be desired. A joke I sometimes tell is, what is the fastest way to solve a problem? What's the fastest way to resolve a defect? The answer? Tell someone that doesn't care. All you're doing is changing the relationship between the problem and the person, and therefore it goes away. It's not a problem to them. Some essential characteristics of problems and solutions are emotions. A problem is undesired. It's something you don't want. You feel a certain way about a problem. An essential characteristic of a solution is that it's desired. It's something that you want. So I would suggest if you encounter a thing and you try and label it as a problem, and to you it doesn't evoke a negative feeling, it's not undesired, then I would question whether that thing is a problem at all. Similarly, if you encounter something and you want to label it as a solution, and perhaps it achieves some goal, but that goal is not desired, I might question whether that thing that you call a solution is a solution at all. So what is this to say? I'm trying to suggest that emotions are an essential characteristic of problems and solutions. When you have a problem, it means, among other things, that a certain emotion is being affected, it's being brought out in the current state. When you have a solution, it means that, among other things, some certain different emotion is being affected in the goal state. So back to the purpose of software. If we agree that software might be to be useful, how to help people, how to help them solve problems, and solving problems affects emotion, then it might be reasonable to say that a purpose of software is to affect emotion, unless. Certainly, there might be exceptions to this. So I encountered one instance with two criteria where emotions might matter less or perhaps not at all. That situation is when there's a monopoly and a necessity. Imagine you have some piece of software and there's only one place to get it. It's a monopoly. And that piece of software or that solution is necessary. It's absolutely essential that you have it. In that case, maybe emotions are not that important. Maybe even if you don't like that solution, since there's only one place to get it and you absolutely must have it, then emotions shouldn't be considered. They're not that important. But if either of these criteria is missing, if you have software that's absolutely necessary, but there's a lot of places to get it, then I would suggest that those different places to get it should focus on emotions, because it's very likely that the people will choose the solution that makes them feel the best way. Similarly, if there's a piece of software and there's only one place to get it, but it's not necessary, it's just desired, then emotions become very important. All of this is to say that a purpose of software is to affect emotion. All right, I'll continue by trying to support my claim with some research. This is a different sort of appeal to authority. This time I'm going to appeal to relevant researchers that probably do have knowledge that's applicable and pertinent to what we're talking about. I'm going to present some quotes from various papers, articles, blogs, studies, dissertations from people that have studied and performed tests. And in the workshop, again, I'll be pausing to ask different people for their opinions on these. I'm going to start with a paper from 2014 called Modeling Emotional Requirements. In it, they say that there are few studies in the literature that specifically address the relation between emotions and software. Now, I encountered this idea in many papers as I did my research, and unfortunately, I found it to be true. There's not a lot of research that focuses specifically on the relationship between emotions and software. This is a partial list of some of the sources that I use to inform my own research and my presentation. I can provide this list and all my complete list of sources if you're interested afterwards. But I'm going to go forward by presenting a few selected quotes that I think are relevant. First comes from a 2005 paper called Is Emotion Relevant to Requirements Engineering? They say they have a viewpoint that argues that emotions are just as important as factors affecting requirements as are any other traditional factor, including function, performance, cost, and user interface. So these researchers suggest that emotional state is just as important. However, a paper that followed in 2006 that was part of the Requirements Engineering Conference, they suggest that emotions and emotional impact are not generally considered critical to the implementation of software. They're highly subjective in nature, resist quantification, yet from a player's perspective, with regards to video games, the induced emotional state is the most important requirement. Any functionality that exists only to further that emotional goal. They continue, player acceptance and market success is driven by the realization of this set of non-functional emotional requirements. So while the previous research has suggested emotions are very important or just as important, these folks in video games believe that it's the most important thing to consider. So what can we do about this? Back to the 2014 paper, Modeling Emotional Requirements. They say and suggest that one way to produce better systems might be to explore users' emotions to uncover these hidden requirements that may otherwise be ignored. Now, one reason I like this quote is because they have the words hidden requirements. I had actually named my presentation before I came across this paper and this quote. But another reason I like it is because it shows that emotions are very, very important and they need to be discovered and uncovered. But another study that I found very interesting was from a case study called Adapting Information Technology as a First Step in Design Lessons Learned from Working with Brazilian Social Volunteers. Easy to say. What they did is they studied a group of developers that was creating an application for a group of Brazilian social workers. Now, this particular group of developers had done prior government work, developed applications for other government organizations, but as they began to gather requirements, they realized and recognized that volunteers are motivated not for money or advancement, but for their own satisfaction. The developers knew that they'd have to understand these emotional factors when they designed a new interactive system for the volunteers to be used for their work. Now, I'll talk a little bit about this later, but the epilogue to this is they did focus on emotions and they did develop an application that was embraced and accepted by these users. It was a great success. I'll talk a little bit later about the method that they used. Finally, why does this matter? Yes.
I think we just lost your audio for last couple of sentences. If you could quickly say that.
Do you know what those last thing you heard was?
I think it was about the embracing part that you were talking about right before that.
Okay. Sorry about that. If I lose connection again, please let me know as soon as possible. Can I get some confirmation that everyone can hear me? Anyone can hear me. Okay, I'm back online. So this group of, I'm not sure what was the last thing I heard, but a group of researchers developed an application and they focused on emotions. And that focus on emotions allowed them to develop an application that was embraced and accepted by these Brazilian social workers. And later on, I'll talk about the means and method by which they did that. So why does any of this matter? The way that people feel about a technology can determine whether technology is embraced or rejected by its intended users. This was the result and conclusion, again, by this 2014 group of researchers in a paper called Modeling Emotional Requirements. All of this research, these particular quotes, and all the research that I've done seems to indicate that emotional requirements can influence software acceptance and should be considered. Now, to me, that seems pretty important if one of your goals is having people accept your software. So finally, the last way I'm going to try and support the claim is talking about requirements. Throughout the presentation, I've included a lot of cartoons of Calvin and Hobbes, and I think that I've tried to find ones that are relevant to each particular section that exemplify the ideas that I'm discussing. I chose these two around requirements because in the first one, Calvin is kind of talking about things that he wants, his desires, and in the second one, he's talking about needs. So that should be a little bit more, that should be more clear as I continue this section. What is a requirement? Again, many different sources, many different ideas and definitions. With regards to software, most definitions can be evaluated to this. A software requirement is some particular thing that a goal that a system should be or do. That is, it's some property or function of a system. Some common formats that I've encountered during my career. In some environments, more traditional development environments, requirements are explicitly written as systems should be or do some particular thing. In some more agile environments, they use user stories, which roughly look like this. As a role, I want goal, so that benefit. Some particular thing that the system is or the system does, and it provides benefits. What are some examples or types of requirements? There's too many to list. This is a little word cloud of just a handful of different types of requirements that people categorize them as. However, I've been talking about general concepts, and I'd like to generalize and give a more general idea of what requirements are outside of software, because I think it might provide more insight and lead to discovery about emotion. More generally, a requirement is a thing that is wanted or needed. Now, the word requirement has an interesting history. It comes from the word require, which is an old French word meaning to seek, ask, demand, petition, and the suffix ment, M-E-N-T, which was the result of a product, or a result or a product of an action. In this case, requirement was the result of a question, of a petition. More recently, it's become something that is needed or wanted. So what is a want? A want, very simply, is something that is desired. A need is something that is necessary. Now, perhaps from a professional standpoint, if you're a tester, maybe you think that you've been a requirement consumer your entire career. That is, someone else has been primarily responsible for getting requirements, eliciting requirements from customers, specifying them, and then they hand them to you to consume. They give them to developers so that they can create an application. Then they give these requirements to testers so they can test and check the application against these specified wants and needs. However, I'd suggest from this general viewpoint, a requirement is anything that is wanted or needed, that we've all been creators and consumers of requirements our entire life. For instance, if anyone's ever ordered a burger and said, hold the cheese, maybe because you had a food allergy. Maybe hold the cheese was a requirement that was a need. You need them to hold the cheese, otherwise bad things will happen. It's essential. If you ever ordered a burger and said, extra mayonnaise, please, maybe that's due to preference. You like mayonnaise. That's a requirement that's a want. It's something that's desired. So from this general perspective, all of us, our entire lives, have not only been consuming requirements, but we've been creating them as well, specifying things that we want, things that we need, things that we require. So wants and needs, how are they related to emotion? I'm going to suggest that the words themselves might elicit emotion. This is a poster that might be familiar to some of you. To those that aren't familiar with it, it's a picture of Uncle Sam. It's from 1917. It was used by the U.S. as a recruitment poster, trying to entice people to enlist in the U.S. Army. It says, I want you, with the implied, to enlist in the Army. What many people don't know is it's a copy. It's a copy of this poster that came out 3 years earlier of Lord Kitchener. It also was eventually used for enlistment purposes to try and get people to enlist in their army. But what was interesting to me is that while both posters had images that were very similar, someone pointing at you, one read, I want you, while the other read, your country needs you. So again, in the workshop, I'll pause to ask people, how do these different posters make you feel? Do they make you feel differently at all? Do they evoke different feelings in you? One article that does some analysis on these two posters suggests that the second one evokes patriotism and guilt in those that have not yet enlisted, but it doesn't stray so far as to be emotional blackmail. I found that to be an interesting quote. But the point is that sometimes even the words want or need, whichever one you choose, might elicit some emotion in the person hearing it. Going further, again, a requirement is a want or a need. How can you distinguish, is it a want or a need? Well, here's one method that I found useful to help me try and determine whether a requirement is something that is simply desired or something that is essential. The first step is identify the requirement. Let's call that X. The next step is establish the purpose, let's call that Y, for X. Now, so far, this might seem familiar because it's basically a restatement of a root cause analysis method some people call the 5 whys. Ask why, what is the purpose, what is the purpose, and keep doing that over and over, which can help you dig down and find underlying reasons and causes. So I'm going to build upon this method with a third step. After you've identified the requirement X and you've established the purpose Y for X, the third step is ask, can Y be achieved without X? That is, can I achieve this purpose without this requirement? If the answer is yes, if you can achieve Y without X, then X is just contributory. It's not necessary, it's just desired, it's a want. But if the answer is no, that is, Y cannot be achieved, this purpose cannot be achieved without this X, this requirement, then X is absolutely essential, it's needed. I'll go through a quick example to try and make this more clear. Imagine the requirement, I require a library card. Using this process, this heuristic, identify the requirement, a library card. Establish the purpose for the library card. Perhaps a purpose for a library card in this case is checking out books from the library. Third, ask, can checking out books from the library be achieved without a library card? Well, certainly you can steal books from the library, but that wouldn't be the purpose, which is checking them out. So I think it's reasonable to say that no, you cannot check out books from the library without a library card. Therefore, the library card is a need. It's absolutely essential to accomplish this purpose. So let's try and repeat this process over and over and see what we can learn. There's our requirement, library card. What's the purpose of it? Is to check out books. Can you achieve checking out books without a library card? No, library card is a need. Let's go further. What if check out books was a requirement? What's the purpose of checking out books? Maybe in some situation, it's to gain knowledge. Can you gain knowledge without checking out books? Well, sure. You can go take a class, or you can read things online. So checking out books is just something that you want. What about gaining knowledge? What's the purpose of gaining knowledge? Well, maybe in some specific circumstances, it's to learn how to cook. Can you learn how to cook without gaining knowledge? I would say no. It's implicit that you gain knowledge if you want to achieve, learn how to cook. Continuing, learning how to cook. Maybe your purpose is to impress someone. Can you impress them in any other way than learning how to cook? Perhaps. Maybe learning to cook is just something that you want to do to impress them. Impress someone. Why? Maybe to date them. Now, can you date them in other ways other than impressing them? Perhaps. Maybe impressing them is just something you want to do because you think it will lead towards dating them. And finally, why do you want to date them? Maybe it's to feel happy. Now, can you feel happy in other ways than dating them? Yeah, maybe chocolate makes you happy, or maybe sleeping in makes you happy. So dating them is just a want because it's just contributing to your feeling happy. But what's interesting about this is this, the last line, to feel happy. If you try and continue this process any further, it starts to get weird. What might be the purpose or the goal to be accomplished from feeling happy? I'm not sure that there's an answer. It's almost like we've hit a bottom here. And feeling happy is an emotion. So what I'm trying to say is that high-level requirements, such as library cards, checking out books, gaining knowledge, these wants and needs, can often originate from very low-level requirements. This entire section is trying to suggest that requirements are wants and needs that can affect and often originate from emotions. The words want or need might elicit certain emotions in those that say or hear them. And very often, wants or needs, if you dig down far enough, might actually originate from some emotion that might be driving that requirement at a high level. So, hopefully by this point, I've done some reasonable support for this claim. The way we feel about software is important. Smita, I think I have about 15 minutes left, so I'm really going to pick up the pace here. Now I'm going to try and suggest some ways that we can act on this claim. First is emotional requirements. Now, there's not a lot of focus on these, mostly in video game development. My research has shown because video games are primarily about evoking some emotion in people. There's also a lot of work in healthcare systems where they're more concerned about patients recovering. And there has been a recent great focus on UX and UI, which is good because it emphasizes user feelings. But I'm going to try and show that emotional requirements might be very, very important, even more important than we currently think, and should be considered for all types of software. Again, a requirement software definition might be a particular thing that thing or goal that a system should be or do. An emotional requirement might be a particular feeling that a system should induce in a particular user. As a reminder, some common requirement formats are a system should be or do some particular thing. If you're in an agile environment, maybe a user story reads, as a role, I want some particular goal so that benefit. Perhaps some suggested emotional requirement formats might be the system should be or do some particular thing in order to induce some feeling in some role, some particular person. Similarly, user stories might be changed to show that as a role, I want some particular goal, some thing or property or function, so that it induces some feeling. Now, what are these feelings? What emotion do you want to induce? That's one thing that you need to consider. Robert Plutchik, an American psychologist, built on the work of Paul Ekman and identified 8 primary emotions. These are the 8 that you see here. Now, there's a lot of different sources that you can go and find other lists of emotions, but this might be a good starting point to use as a basic emotional vocabulary for representing and expanding on these states. But I encourage you to go find and use your own list that you feel more appropriate. Some other important considerations are the target, the role, the user. Who do you want to induce this emotion? Think about your different users, because the emotions that you induce in group A might be different than the emotions that are induced in group B. Also, the means. How do you intend to induce this emotion? In what way is your software going to try and make people feel satisfied, safe, happy? And finally, the context. What is the circumstances? I'm going to talk a little bit about a usability matrix of emotion by David Greenlees later that is very useful for thinking about these different considerations. So how do we get emotional requirements? Again, the subjective nature of emotions makes identifying and specifying them very, very difficult. But there are some qualitative and quantitative research methods that give ways and can offer insight and understanding to the underlying reasons, motivations, opinions, perceptions, and emotions of some target group. So here's just a few suggested methods, some practical ways that you might find that you can discover and make explicit these particular emotional requirements, things that are intended to be induced by various system properties or functions. Now, this is not a comprehensive list. It's just a handful of ways that might work for you. First is interviews and discussions. You can do interviews with individuals, one-on-one. You can do small focus group interviews. You can have discussions with people. It might behoove you to look up questions and understand different types of questions that can elicit different types of responses. There's closed type questions that can come in binary form, yes, no, black, white, multiple choice, ordinal scale. There's open-ended questions that start with words like what, where, when, who, why, that open up discussion and allow users to give more robust answers. There's probing questions that follow up on previous answers. Be careful of leading questions that suggest an answer, or loaded questions that contain unjustified assumptions. You might consider meta questions, asking them, is there anything that you would like me to ask that I didn't? Is there anything else I should ask? Another potential way of eliciting and finding and discovering some emotional requirements are surveys, polls, or questions. There's different types of these. There's structured, where you get fixed response. There's non-structured. You can use ratings, such as a scale of 1 to 10. How did you feel? Or how do you want to feel? Or there's rankings. Rank in order of preference what things are most important to you. Observations. Watch users in their environment, but beware of the Hawthorne effect, also called observer effect. Sometimes those being observed will alter their behavior because they're aware of that they're being observed. Another way, personas. These are basically fictional characters based on research, either real or imagined data that might represent the different types of users that might be interacting and using your system. These personas might help you imagine different scenarios and emotions that are intended to be induced by various system properties or functions. There's other methods that come from different social sciences. Ethnography is a systematic study of people and cultures. It's field-based. They also use interviews and observations and discussions, and it provides detailed, in-depth description of everyday life and practice. That might be a great way to find out the motivations and emotions of the users and which emotions you should try and intend to induce through the system. Another one called UDUM, Underlying Discourse Unveiling Method. This is the method that I talked about earlier. There was a group of developers that made an application for some Brazilian social workers. This was the particular method that they used. It's developed for clinical psychology research. It makes it possible to uncover underlying meanings, motivations, conflicts. They were able to observe and interact with these workers and find out what motivated them and use those motivations as the base requirements for this system. And again, as an epilogue, it was a very greatly embraced system and it was a success. Finally, I mentioned the usability matrix of emotions. This was from David Greenlees in a 2013 Sticky Minds post. It's a great way to capture emotions that you intend to be induced by various system properties or functions. The rows are different things that your system is or things that your system does. The business system, different types of functional and non-functional requirements. The columns are different emotions that you might intend to be induced. And what David suggests is not only thinking about how users might, how these emotions might be induced during and after system use, but also before. If you have an angry user before they use your product, how might that affect how they feel about using your product? Next, measuring some emotional requirements. How did the user actually feel? How do you measure, check, test, or compare the intended emotions against the actual ones? Now, it's important to remember that regarding all results from testing emotions, Jerry Weinberg says that the key to handling emotions in any situation starts with the understanding that emotions are suggestions that something important might be happening. Now, again, this list is far from comprehensive. It's just a few ways that I'm going to suggest. But there's many, many resources out there for you to continue and follow up and learn more about any of these methods that I'm suggesting. and maybe apply them in your own context. Now, ideally, if you wanted to know how a user actually feels, we could use telepathy. That'd be great if we could read people's minds, read how they feel. We'd know exactly how they felt about our particular application. But unfortunately, that's not a viable option. Another interesting method I found that people tried to use to measure emotions was by monitoring brain activity, using diodes to try and measure electrical activity in the brain. Now, unfortunately, that proved to be not an effective way. There was no reliable connection between electrical signals in the brain and the way that people self-reported that they felt. But here's some other methods that you might find that are useful. And you'll notice that many of these methods were used as ways to get and elicit emotional requirements as well. First, interviews and discussions. Again, consider different types of interviews and different types of discussions and questions that you can ask users. You also might consider the timing. If you ask someone while they're using a product or immediately after, they might report different answers than if you wait a week. Sometimes if someone's very angry right now about your product, a week later, maybe they cooled off. So maybe it's important to consider when you ask these questions. And again, also consider the size of the group, the types of questions that you ask, and which types of results you're interested in eliciting. Again, surveys, polls, and questionnaires, just different ways of rating and ranking people's emotions, getting them to self-report. To what degree did they experience some emotion? You might try and quantify it by asking how many people. Maybe if you have 100 people in some focus group, you might be interested and hope that 70% of them reported feeling some emotion as they used this particular part of the product. Observing people. Again, the Hawthorne effect. Be careful as you observe them because it might alter their behavior. But you can watch people as they use the system to see from different body language and facial expressions and how they use the product, perhaps what feelings and emotions are being induced. Role play. If you can't get a hold of actual users, perhaps you can try role-playing. Role-playing is imagining that you are one of these users, trying to embody the feelings, the experiences, the background of certain users, then using the product yourself and imagining what they might feel. Now, all of these ways are useful in different contexts, and I wouldn't suggest relying on any single way. A combination of ways is probably the strongest. Here's a few more ways, again, I found from sociology and psychology. The first is discrete emotions questionnaire. It's a tool for measuring the state of self-reported emotions. It's sensitive to 8 distinct state emotions. Next is the Rice profile, developed by Dr. Stephen Rice at The Ohio State University, and it's intended to measure what he calls 16 basic desires of an individual. My favorite that I found was the Product Emotion Measurement Instrument, PRIMO. What it does is it has a set of 14 different animated characters that after people experience or use some system or product, they can use these animated characters and select the one that best represents their current emotional feeling. Finally, the usability matrix of emotion. Again, a great tool from David Greenlees in his 2013 Sticky Minds post. It's a great way to capture the emotions that users are actually induced, or the emotions that are actually induced by various users as they use the system. So there are many methods to get and measure emotional requirements. Finally, placebos. Let's talk about placebos. Now, this is a very large and largely unexplored topic. I've learned a lot about them and think it's very fascinating, but this is not a talk about placebos. Instead, I just want to use placebos to think about software in terms of them. I think it can be helpful, and I'm going to today present 3 particular ways. In the workshop, I'll use more ways, and also in the workshop, most of these things that I discuss are going to be exercises that we talk about and do to help exemplify these different ideas. Now, unfortunately, that's not possible in a webinar format, but at least the introduction of the ideas might be beneficial. First, the word placebo. It comes from the word placebo comes from Latin. It means I shall please. In medieval times, there were hired mourners participating in vespers for the dead, and they often chanted the 9th line of Psalm 116, I shall please the dead in the land of the living. However, because these mourners were hired, their emotions were considered insincere, and so they were called placebos. So the word itself has always carried some mixed and sometimes negative connotations. Now, placebo, again, as with many of definitions, depending on where you look, you get different ideas and different answers. This is a definition that I came up with that I think contains all of the essential characteristics of a placebo. A placebo, in a general sense, is anything or procedure that is intended solely for mental effects but purports to also have and may actually result in physical effects as well. There's also a thing called the placebo response. Now, imprecision regarding the definition of placebo effect and placebo response is a crucial problem, says one paper. Since this is such an unexplored and poorly understood area, there's still a lot of questions and distinctions between placebo response and placebo effect. Often they're used as synonyms when in fact there's a slight difference. Placebo response is a beneficial physical effect that is seemingly caused by a placebo, but cannot be attributed to the physical properties of the placebo. That is, it makes people feel good, even though there's no reason that it should, other than some emotional, mental effect. There's a converse effect called the nocebo effect. In Latin, nocebo means I will harm, rather than placebo meaning I shall please. A nocebo is a detrimental physical effect, again, seemingly caused by a placebo, but cannot be attributed to the physical properties of the placebo itself. A voodoo curse is a good example of this. How are placebos used? One way is clinically. In a 2008 survey of Chicago area doctors, nearly half of them reported that they had used placebos in their medical practice. That is, they had prescribed a placebo for various reasons. Now, doctors can truthfully state when prescribing a placebo that the prescription should help the symptoms, but they might omit how it will work. That is, it will work through some psychological association. The placebo response is very real. Now, there's an old fundamental principle that comes from medicine: cure occasionally, relieve often, console always. And that leads to the placebo paradox, that while it may be unethical to use a placebo, that is, to lie to patients, conversely, it also might be unethical to not use a placebo, that is, to not prescribe something that could heal, that could relieve, console, or comfort. Another way that placebos are used is experimentally, as a control in drug studies. The Food and Drug Administration in the US says that before a new drug can be marketed, it must show through adequate and well-controlled clinical studies that it's effective. And randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled experiments have become the standard, the gold standard, by which most other experimental methods are judged. They're used to control variables. And finally, the one that's most interesting and relevant to this particular presentation is conditioning. Outside of clinical and experimental uses of placebos are other types of placebos that can use to train or accustom someone to accept or appease in certain situations or certain circumstances. It's similar to Pavlov's dogs, where they're classically conditioned and they pair some stimulus with some response. In a book called Idiot Buttons, the Placebo and UX Design, they say users love control. Even in an automated world, users want to control the machine. However, in an age of more intuitive interfaces, control is slipping out of the user's hands. However, the placebo prevents this. The placebo places control back into the user's hands, even though it does nothing. So I want to talk a little bit more about conditioning. Ellen Langer is a Harvard professor, and she's done a lot of work and study on placebos, and she says that feeling you have control over your world is a desirable state. So I want to give a few examples of how placebos might be used in a non-clinical or experimental setting as conditioning. The first is thermostats. This is a very well-known one. Perhaps you've heard that some thermostats in office buildings and corporations are fake. They're not actually hooked up to anything. A 2003 news article said that investigation relieved that some thermostats aren't connected to any HVAC system at all, but the placebo effect was satisfactory and successful to the intended use. Crossing street buttons. A 2004 article in the New York Times said that more than 2,500 of the 3,200 walk buttons in New York City that existed were essentially mechanical placebos. In 2010, ABC News found only one functioning button in surveys in 3 different cities across America. They only exist to appease someone, to placate them. Door closing buttons in elevators. There's a lot of articles about this. This is a very famous mechanical placebo. In most elevators built or installed since the 90s, many of the door close buttons don't work. They're just there to make you think it works, to give you or make you think that you have control. In 2016, Otis, a big elevator manufacturer, said that the door close button is optional based on customer specification. The customer decides whether the button is connected and actually functions in any way. But let's talk about some that are closer to technology. Progress bars. Sometimes progress bars try to show the amount of completed and remaining work of some task. But sometimes they're just a best guess, and sometimes they don't report any accurate information at all. Sometimes they're not hooked up to anything. Chris Harrison, who is at Carnegie Mellon, has done a lot of work in progress bars and found that different progress bars and different types of spinners can affect users in different ways. In fact, he found that even if a user knows that a progress bar isn't hooked up to anything, they would prefer it over no progress bar at all. They prefer to know that something is happening. As far back as 1985, I found an article where someone talks about an installation of Ultrix 1.0 on a VAX that printed dots to show progress of the task. When they examined the program closely, they found it was just a hollow shell script that printed dots. It had no bearing on the actual amount of work being done or completed. Refresh buttons and save buttons. Oftentimes with modern applications that auto-adjust their contents, these buttons aren't really needed. Applications will refresh themselves or save with every character input, such as Google Docs. However, many users feel they want to remove the uncertainty of putting the trust in the machine, and they would rather have a refresh or save button that doesn't do anything at all because it makes them feel that they have some type of control. So in the workshop, I'll be going over some more ways to think about software in terms of placebos. Right now, I'm going to give you 3 ways, and then we'll be done. The first is isolating emotions. The first way to think about software in terms of placebos is about isolating emotions. Sometimes when you're studying or experimenting or testing something, it might be helpful to control, manage, isolate, or remove certain variables so that you can focus on other variables. In fact, that's one way that placebos are used, as a control. Now, if the thing that you want to think about, experiment, or study is emotions in software, it might be helpful to try and control or isolate other non-emotional variables that might be distracting. Now, since the intent of placebos is just to affect emotion, it might be helpful to think about software in terms of placebos. This can help you isolate non-emotional variables, to remove them or control them, and think about only the emotional effects that are to be induced from some function or property of a system. I'm suggesting that you imagine some function or property of a system as a placebo, that is, it only exists to affect emotion, and this might help you better focus on the emotions. In the workshop, I'll be doing several exercises that, again, hope to exemplify and allow users to dig in and practice thinking about system functions and properties in terms of placebos. Imagine that some function or property is just a placebo to better consider the intended emotions that it should induce. The next way I want to think about software in terms of placebos is by thinking about them in terms of bugs. What insight can we get? First, what is a bug? I've already provided a definition of problem, an undesired state that differs from some desired state. It's some violation of some want, need, or expectation, but whose wants, needs, or expectations? And what are expectations? Are they based on what you think will happen? Are the expectations based on what you think should happen? Now consider a bug or any problem in terms of placebos. Now remember, a placebo is intended solely for mental effects, but it purports to also have some physical effects. So what if you have some placebo that does exactly as it's intended? What if you have a placebo that's intended to make you feel a little happy, and it does, in fact, make you feel a little happy? Well, that's great. It does what it's intended, no problem. But what if you have a placebo that does something other than is intended? What if you have a placebo that's intended to make you feel a little happy, and it makes you feel a little sad instead? That might be more obvious that there's a problem here. There's some kind of defect or bug. What if you have a placebo that does nothing? What if it's a particular placebo is intended to make you feel happy, but it does nothing at all? It has no effect. Is that a bug? What if the placebo does more than is intended? What if it's intended to make you feel a little happy, but it actually makes you feel ecstatic, elated, euphoric even? Is that a bug? What if the placebo is intended to make you feel a little happy, and it does make you feel a little happy, but it also has some other physical or emotional effect? Finally, what if repeated use of the placebo makes you feel differently than is intended? What if some placebo is intended to make you feel happy, and initial use of the placebo does make you feel happy, but repeated use of the same placebo makes you feel mad? Imagine turning a thermostat that's not connected to anything, a placebo thermostat, up. Initially, you may have an emotional response and feel placated, feel a little happy. But perhaps after some time, you don't feel any warmer, so you go and you return to the thermostat and turn it up more. And this time, it doesn't make you feel as happy. So you turn it up even more and more. And each time you turn it up, you don't feel any warmer, and now you're getting angrier and angrier. So thinking about bugs in terms of placebos, when they do something that's other than intended, more than intended, do nothing at all, or perhaps a repeated use might be useful. And for each of these scenarios, consider the relativity of it. Consider the point of view from the source, the creator, the designer, maybe the doctor, or consider the point of view from the target, the customer, the different users that might be using this placebo. If you're designing emotional requirements, each of these considerations might be important to consider, and it might be important to consider non-emotional requirements. Any business system, functional, property, or thing that the system does, you can use these same scenarios to gain insight. Consider various scenarios to help determine intended and unintended results. The final way is ethics. There's a lot of talk and studies around the ethics of placebos. Is it ethical to lie to someone? Are there charitable lies if you're doing it for their benefit? Thomas Aquinas claimed there were three types of lies: malicious, jocose, which are told in fun, and officious lies. They're helpful and pardonable. So is it ethical to build in these officious lies to our software? 2014 article called "How Should We Program Computers to Deceive" talks about a bus stop near a senior center in Dusseldorf, Germany. But there's no bus that comes to this stop. The purpose and intention of the bus is to be a honey trap, to lure patients with dementia that might have wandered off the property. They think it's a real bus stop, and they sit there. And that allows the workers to find them better and bring them back onto the property. They're lying. This is a lie, but it's intended for good purpose. So good design is honest. Good design is honest is one of the 10 principles of good design, set down by the German designer Dieter Rams. You should not lie to your users. However, is that always the case? Consider the difference between benevolent and malevolent deception. In a 2013 paper entitled "Benevolent Deception in Human-Computer Interaction," they say that the research community has focused its energy on eradicating malicious deception, but ignored instances in which this deception is positively employed. They conclude that there's opportunities in benevolent deception for improving our understanding and ability to craft useful systems. There are certain times that are worthy of pursuit to understand the motives for deceptions, the user's perception of motive, patterns of deception, measures of effective deception, and cultural and ethical concerns. There's some examples, a few examples of benevolent deception, and some of these are right on the fence. It's hard to tell whether they are benevolent or malevolent, whether for the benefit of the user or someone else. Netflix outages. Sometimes if there's a Netflix outage, instead of getting your personal movie recommendations, instead of reporting an error, in fact, they will just provide popular movie suggestions. That's a lie. You're not getting your movie suggestions, you're just getting popular ones, although you may not recognize that. But that's for the benefit of the user. Sometimes amusement parks will have wait time signs that are purposely overestimating how much time it takes till you get to ride the ride. They do that to soothe the anxious nerves of people waiting. 1960s phone systems would sometimes misdial, but rather than telling users that there was an error, they would just go ahead and connect the call, and then users would assume that it was their fault. There's other examples of benevolent deception in technology and mechanics. Some examples of malevolent deception: roaming online ads that trick you into clicking them when all you really want to do is close them. They move around and you accidentally click on the advertisement. Sometimes you may have encountered confusing or unclear privacy settings or unsubscribed forms, or maybe even unsubscribed forms that don't work at all. These are true placebos, ways that we're being lied to that are certainly not for our benefit. And in the future, true artificial intelligence systems are going to alter the game significantly. If the goal is to make artificial intelligence as human-like as possible, these machines and technologies, by definition, are going to have to be programmed to know when to be honest and when to lie to us. So I wonder, are there times when it is reasonable to intentionally deceive users when it's for their benefit? It might be reasonable to consider intentionally deceiving users for their benefit. All of this to say that thinking about software in terms of placebos can be useful. So in summary, successful businesses and people recognize the importance of emotion. A purpose of software might be to affect emotion. Research indicates that emotional requirements can influence software acceptance and should be considered. Requirements are wants or needs that can affect and often originate from emotions. There's many methods to get and to measure emotional requirements, and sometimes thinking about software in terms of placebos can actually be useful. All of this to support the claim that the way we feel about software is important, and give you a few ways to act on it. So thank you very, very much. This has been the Hidden Requirements, Exploring Emotions with Placebos. My name is Damien Sinadinos with Ineffable Solutions. I hope it has been pleasant and induced some good emotions in you. I hope this made you happy and excited and wonderful and interested and satisfied. And I also hope that it served to inspire you to think more about this and motivate you to act and consider the importance of emotions in software. Remember, it is a magical world, so please keep exploring. Thanks.
Thanks, Damien. Thank you for your time today. It was a very insightful session on relationship between people, emotions, and requirements. I'm sure our attendees found it very informative and useful too. Thanks again, and I hope to see you in Washington.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, there are some questions, Damien, but I think we are running over time. So we're going to just send you the questions and we can post your responses to them on our site.
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, everyone, this concludes our webinar for today. So thanks everyone for joining. And stay tuned for more webinars and online trainings coming soon. And if you haven't yet signed up for the upcoming webinar, which is Continuous Integration and How It Affects Testing by Paul Merrill on 9th of August, then the link is up for registration at softwaretestpro.com. Go ahead, have a look and register for yourself. Thanks everyone. Have a great week ahead. See you all in Washington.